September 7th, 1876. 8 men rode out of Northfield, Minnesota with $7,000 and the full weight of the United States law behind them. 2 of their own were already dead on the bank floor. 3 more were bleeding in the saddle. The Pinkerton Agency had their descriptions. Every sheriff between Minnesota and Missouri had their names. The net was tightening from every direction simultaneously. And they rode into it, carrying $7,000 that would be gone before the year was out. Not seized, not confiscated, spent. Horses bledded. Weapons bledded. Hideouts and bought silence and lawyers charging $50 an hour. All of it consumed the Northfield money the way the frontier consumed everything it touched. Completely, without sentiment, without leaving much behind. $7,000, the kind of money a Kansas cowhand would spend 17 years accumulating. And the James Younger gang ran through it like water through a cracked canteen. The wanted posters said these men were dangerous. They were. But they were also broke most of the time. And the story of where the money went, every dollar, every time, is the story the legend never told, and the wanted posters never printed. This is American Old West Tales, where the frontier gets the honest accounting it has always deserved. Subscribe now, because what follows is the complete record of how outlaws spent their money, right down to the sawdust on the saloon floor where most of it ended up. The first thing every outlaw bought after a successful job was not whiskey. It was not a woman. It was not a card game. It was a horse. A blown horse on open ground, with a posse 3 miles back, was a death sentence with a short delay. The animal under a man was the only variable between freedom and Fort Smith. And every serious outlaw on the frontier understood this with the practical clarity of someone whose survival had been decided by it more than once. Butch Cassidy grasped this better than any man of his era. After the wild bunch hit the Union Pacific near Wilcox, Wyoming on June 2nd, 1899, pulling between $30,000 and $60,000 from a single express car, Cassidy's first investment was not a Denver saloon. It was a relay string of fresh horses cached across the escape route before the robbery was ever attempted, placed with the logistical precision of a military quartermaster. The Bassett sisters at their Browns Park Ranch supplied the wild bunch with fresh mounts and provisions on a standing retainer, a commercial supply contract between working outlaws and sympathetic ranchers that operated across the frontier with the quiet regularity of any other business arrangement. A quality horse in the 1880s cost between $50 and $150. Fast horses bought without questions cost considerably more. It was the first line on every outlaw's ledger, and it was never a small number. Then came the weapons. A Colt single-action Army revolver, the gun that ended more frontier arguments than any other, cost $17 at retail. A Winchester Model 1873 ran $22 to $28. Neither price included the ammunition a man outside the law burned through at a rate no honest citizen could imagine. Weapons cracked in river crossings. Weapons were dropped in dark runs through brushy country and never recovered. A working outlaw replaced his iron the way a carpenter replaces a worn chisel, regularly, without sentiment, as the cost of staying in the trade. Horses, weapons, ammunition. Replacement clothing when the wanted descriptions circulated. And every dollar of it spent before a single boot crossed a saloon threshold. What was left walked straight through that threshold. A shot of whiskey ran 25 cents in any respectable frontier saloon. A beer was a nickel. These prices did not ruin a man carrying folded Union Pacific currency. What ruined him was the architecture of the room he was drinking in. The frontier saloon was not a place that sold whiskey. It was a machine engineered, from the length of the bar, to the position of the tables, to the quality of the lighting in the back, to move money from a man's pocket to the house's strongbox before he sobered up enough to notice. The rounds bought for strangers, the bottle ordered instead of the shot. The slow drift from the bar toward the green felt in the back where the real work happened. That green felt was a faro layout, not poker. Faro. This distinction matters, and almost nobody makes it. Faro was the dominant gambling game of the American West from the 1840s through the early 1900s. Not because it was exciting, but because the house margin was thin enough to give a man genuine mathematical hope, thin enough to keep him playing. The dealer worked a painted layout of 13 card values. Players placed bets. Cards were drawn in pairs from a dealing box. The house edge on a straight bet ran less than 2%, better odds than almost any game available. Men who understood probability played faro over poker, specifically because the numbers were more honest. The numbers were still eating them alive, at 25 cents minimum in a Dodge City house with no ceiling on the wager. A man who sat down at the faro table with $200 and a run of ordinary luck would stand up with nothing inside 3 hours. Jesse James lost money at racetracks and gambling halls with a consistency that his biographers have always framed as a personal weakness. It was not a weakness. It was mathematics applied to a man with no bank account, no legitimate investment option, and every incentive the saloon economy could manufacture to keep him at the table until the money was gone. Every outlaw with money ended up at the table. Every table sent them back out into the frontier with less than they brought in. What was left walked straight through that threshold. A shot of whiskey ran 25 cents in any respectable frontier saloon. A beer was a nickel. These prices did not ruin a man carrying folded Union Pacific currency. But the saloon was not where the real money disappeared. The real money disappeared quietly, in back rooms, across kitchen tables in farmhouses 30 miles from the nearest town, in handshakes with men whose names never appeared in any court record because appearing in a court record was precisely what they were being paid, dénigré to prevent. Silence was a commodity on the frontier, and it carried a market price like everything else. A livery stable owner who did not remember which horses had been sold to which men the previous Tuesday. A hotel keeper whose register showed no guests on the night 4 heavily armed strangers spent it in his rooms. A small rancher who fed and sheltered 2 men for a week and could not subsequently recall their faces. These men did not provide these services out of sentiment or sympathy alone. They were paid regularly, in amounts calibrated to the specific risk their silence represented. The Wild Bunch maintained a network of safe ranches across Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah that functioned as a paid logistics chain. The cost of that chain ran continuously, whether the gang was working or resting. A fixed operational expense that the robbery money had to cover before anything reached a card table or a whiskey glass. Then came the lawyers. Cole Younger's legal defense after Northfield cost money that the Youngers did not have after the robbery failed. The arrangements funneled through the Santa Fe ring to keep territorial charges reduced or dismissed entirely cost money that never appeared in any public accounting. The outlaws who survived the longest on the frontier were frequently the ones who spent the most deliberately on legal protection, who understood that a good attorney in the right jurisdiction was a more reliable investment than anything the faro table offered. Horses, weapons, silence, lawyers, saloon, table. Run that circuit once and the money is gone. Run it twice and a man is already calculating the next job before the second circuit is finished. Not because he is reckless, but because the math of the outlaw life never closed any other way. In the spring of 1876, a James gang recruit named Hobbs Carey made the mistake that the outlaw economy made inevitable sooner or later. He got careless with the money. Fresh from a Missouri robbery, Carey spent visibly and talked loosely and gave the Pinkertons the thread they needed to pull. When they pulled it, he told them everything. Names, locations, methods, routes. Not because he was disloyal by nature, because men who burn through money fast end up in situations where the law holds all the leverage and leverage talks. Carey's carelessness was not a character flaw. It was the predictable endpoint of a financial system that had been designed, from the first dollar spent on the first fresh horse, to put an outlaw in exactly that position. They robbed the banks. The frontier robbed them back, every time, without a gun, without a mask, without a single wanted poster ever being printed with its name on it. The frontier just opened its doors, set the whiskey on the bar, and waited. It never had to wait long.